Elijah had always been the kind of man who did not seek attention. He was a man of few words and believed actions spoke louder than anything he could say. As a delivery driver for upscale restaurants, Elijah knew the drill well. Every day he would drive his truck, make his deliveries, and leave the same way he came in, quiet, unassuming, and unnoticed. But on this particular day, things would be different. His calm demeanor would be tested, and the judgments of others would be challenged. That morning, Elijah had woken up early as usual. He had brewed his coffee, read the news, and prepared for another long day of deliveries. As he slipped into his uniform, an old, yet neatly pressed shirt with the restaurant's logo on it, he briefly glanced at himself in the mirror. He didn't care much for his appearance. His focus was always on getting the job done right. He had a quiet confidence, a work ethic that he had built over the years, and a sense of pride in his job. He knew the value of what he brought to the table, even if the world didn't see it. His first stop of the day was Bel Andrea's, an upscale, exclusive restaurant known for its high-end clientele and fine dining experience. The chef there, an arrogant and pompous man named Oliver, had a reputation for making others feel small. Elijah had been to this restaurant before, but he had never quite experienced the level of disdain that he would encounter today. As he parked his truck outside the restaurant, he could already feel the weight of the judgmental eyes from the staff members who stood in the kitchen windows, peering out at him. Elijah shook his head, knowing that this type of treatment was all too common for someone in his position. He wasn't a chef or a high-end manager, he was just a delivery driver. The staff saw him as someone beneath them, someone who didn't belong in their world. Elijah had learned to shrug off their looks and their remarks. After all, he had bigger things on his mind. With a deep breath, he entered the back door of the restaurant, his boots clicking on the cold floor as he made his way through the narrow hallway. The first sign of mockery came from a waiter named Greg, a young man with a sharp tongue and a superiority complex. Greg had been standing near the kitchen, sipping on an espresso, when he saw Elijah walking by. "Hey, are you sure you're at the right restaurant? I don't know if they accept delivery drivers here," Greg sneered. Elijah glanced at him but didn't respond. He simply continued his walk to the kitchen. Greg's voice grew louder as he followed him. "What are you going to do?" "Drop off some frozen pizzas," he said with a laugh. The other staff members who were prepping for the day's service all turned to look at Elijah, some of them snickering under their breath. The kitchen was chaotic, the chefs moving quickly to prepare the ingredients for the day's meals. Elijah made his way over to the prep counter where the head chef, Oliver, stood with his back to him, barking orders at his staff. When Oliver finally turned and saw Elijah, his face twisted into a look of disdain. "You're late," he said sharply. "The produce should have been here an hour ago. You think you can just walk in here whenever you please?" Elijah remained calm. He placed the delivery crates down onto the counter, not allowing the words to get under his skin. "I'm not late. The traffic was heavy this morning," Elijah replied in a measured tone. Oliver scowled. "Excuses? I don't care about your traffic problems, Elijah. I need this kitchen to run on time. I don't have time for slackers." His tone was dismissive, and Elijah could feel the sting of his words, but he didn't react. He'd heard this before from other chefs, managers, and even customers. He had learned long ago not to let these things affect him. He had a job to do, and that was all that mattered. As Elijah began unloading the crates, the mockery continued. "Careful, don't break anything," Greg called from the doorway, still holding his espresso. "Wouldn't want to ruin the chef's precious ingredients, right?" The others in the kitchen chuckled, and Elijah felt the weight of their laughter. But he didn't flinch. Despite the jabs, Elijah kept his composure. He knew this was just part of the job. The ridicule was a product of the elitist culture that dominated the restaurant world. But Elijah wasn't intimidated. He had seen it all before. He understood that to the people in this kitchen, he was nothing more than a nameless face in the background. But he also knew that they didn't see the bigger picture, that he had more influence and power than they could ever imagine. As he finished unloading the crates, he made his way toward the back exit. Before he left, he paused for a moment, looking around the kitchen. He could sense the tension in the air, the arrogance, the sense of entitlement, but he remained silent, nodding politely to those around him. "Have a good day, folks," he said quietly, then turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, Greg's voice echoed through the kitchen. "I'll see you around, delivery boy," Greg called after him, still mocking him. Elijah didn't respond. He simply walked out, his head held high. As Elijah got into his truck and started the engine, he looked back at the restaurant one last time. There was a sense of resolve in his eyes, a quiet determination that no one could understand. He knew that one day the tables would turn. He knew that one day they would all see him for who he truly was. But for now, he let the mockery roll off his back. After all, he had learned long ago that the opinions of others didn't define him. Elijah's journey wasn't just about making deliveries. It was about more than that. It was about building something bigger, something that the staff at Bel Andrea's could never imagine. And as he drove away, the wheels of his plan began to turn. Elijah's life, though calm and reserved on the outside, was shaped by the challenges he faced in a world where status and appearance were everything. After the mocking incident at Bel Andrea's, he spent the rest of the day reflecting on the humiliation he had endured. Yet, it wasn't the insult that bothered him, it was the way people, like Greg and Oliver, seemed to have such an inflated sense of self-importance. They thought that because of their jobs, their skills, or their uniforms, they were somehow superior. As Elijah continued with his deliveries, his mind wandered back to the condescending words of the restaurant staff. The day had been long, and while he was used to being overlooked or dismissed, today had felt different. For some reason, their treatment stung more than it ever had before. Elijah couldn't put his finger on it, but something inside him stirred. But as the hours passed, Elijah began to understand that this feeling of irritation wasn't weakness, it was motivation. For so long, he had kept his head down, doing his job without complaint, but the ridicule had struck a chord deep within him. Perhaps it was time to shift his perspective, and in doing so, change his destiny. Elijah wasn't one to act impulsively, but the treatment he'd received at the restaurant began to fuel a desire to prove those who mocked him wrong. He wasn't just some anonymous driver with no ambitions. He knew that he had something to offer the world. He had skills, experience, and a keen mind that had been underutilized. No longer would he be a background player in his own story. He would take control. That night, as he sat at his small kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea, Elijah reflected on the mocking words. He thought about how often he'd been underestimated in life, by people at work, by family, and by strangers. It wasn't just the incident at the restaurant, it was a pattern he'd seen his whole life. He had always been cast aside or judged based on his occupation, his modest appearance, and the simple life he lived. But today, something had shifted inside him. He realized that the mockery he had faced was a reflection of society's narrow view of success. To the world, success was often defined by wealth, prestige, and status. But to Elijah, success meant resilience, character, and the ability to adapt and rise above adversity. He realized that he didn't need to prove his worth to anyone, especially not to people who judged him from their ivory towers. But he did want to prove something to himself. Determined to start anew, Elijah went to bed that night with a renewed sense of purpose. He began thinking about how he could build a future where people wouldn't mock him based on his job or appearance. He understood that it wasn't going to be easy, his road ahead would be full of obstacles, but the humiliation he had suffered wasn't going to be in vain. It would serve as the catalyst for the changes he was about to make. In the days that followed, Elijah started brainstorming. He knew that he had skills beyond his delivery job. Over the years, he had learned about business, logistics, and marketing, all of which had given him the confidence to believe that he could succeed outside the narrow boundaries that had been set for him. What if he could launch his own business? What if he could create a brand or a service that would make people sit up and take notice? He was no longer going to be just a delivery driver. Elijah knew he had the potential to be something much greater. He spent every spare moment researching business ideas, learning about entrepreneurship, and considering what niche he could fill. He knew that building a business wouldn't be easy. He'd need money, resources, and connections. But he had something more important. A fire inside him, a drive that he had never felt before. Elijah's quiet resilience had always been his strength. But now, it was time for him to step into the light. His humble beginnings and his unassuming nature were no longer liabilities, they were part of his story, and he would use them to his advantage. He didn't need validation from the likes of Greg or Oliver. He would show the world that it was his actions, not his title or appearance, that defined who he was, and so he set to work, determined to transform his life. He started making connections, reaching out to people in the business world, and learning from those who had gone down the path he now hoped to walk. He wasn't going to let the elitism and mockery he had experienced keep him down. Instead, it would be the fuel that powered his next steps. By the time Elijah had launched his new business, it was clear that the world wasn't prepared for the quiet man who had once been relegated to the background. His entrepreneurial spirit, which had been lying dormant for so long, had been awakened by the mockery he had faced. Elijah didn't just want to prove a point to the people who had belittled him, he wanted to create something meaningful. His business was grounded in his experiences as a delivery driver, but it had a twist. Elijah's company offered eco-friendly, quick, and efficient delivery services for restaurants, a service that focused on both sustainability and speed, something that hadn't yet been fully explored in the market. As the business started to grow, Elijah faced a combination of excitement and skepticism from the public. Some of his former colleagues from the restaurant world were among the first to dismiss his venture, seeing it as nothing more than a fleeting idea that would fail like so many others. But Elijah's determination was steadfast. He wasn't in this to prove anyone wrong, he was in it to succeed on his own terms. The turning point came when Elijah received a request from a well-known local restaurant that had previously mocked him at Bel Andreas. They had seen the success of his eco-friendly delivery service and were interested in partnering with him. At first, Elijah was tempted to turn them away, to show them that he didn't need their approval. But after some reflection, he realized that this partnership could elevate his business to a new level. With this deal, Elijah was able to expand his operation. He hired more drivers, increased his service offerings, and began to work with larger restaurants that valued his business model. It didn't take long before Elijah was the talk of the town, with his business growing rapidly. The same people who had once ridiculed him were now trying to get on his good side, offering him deals and partnerships that seemed to come out of nowhere. But Elijah stayed grounded. He knew what it felt like to be overlooked, and he wasn't about to forget where he came from. As the business flourished, the media began to take notice. Articles about Elijah's rise to success were published, and people started calling him a local legend. For Elijah, it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about proving that hard work, dedication, and resilience could overcome any obstacle. He was living proof that success didn't require a prestigious title or a lavish lifestyle. It required a strong will and the willingness to push through adversity. As Elijah's business continued to grow, he faced an unexpected challenge that came from his past. He had come a long way from the man who once felt the sting of mockery and ridicule, but as his reputation grew, so did the complexities of his journey. In his newfound success, Elijah began to encounter former colleagues and friends, some of whom had doubted him and others who had once underestimated him. One of the most poignant moments came when he crossed paths with Greg and Oliver, the two men who had humiliated him in front of the restaurant staff years earlier. At first, Elijah didn't recognize them. They had changed jobs, moved to new roles in other companies, and the years had not been kind to them. Greg, once the confident leader of his team, now seemed somewhat deflated, while Oliver appeared to be struggling with his own career. Elijah didn't hold any bitterness in his heart toward them, but he could sense that they were looking at him in a new light. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same people who had once dismissed him were now approaching him with an air of respect. "Hey, Elijah," Greg greeted him, his voice softening with a hint of humility. "I've been hearing a lot about your business lately. You're doing great." Oliver nodded in agreement, his eyes filled with an unspoken apology. "Yeah, we didn't realize how big this would get. You've really made something of yourself." For a moment, Elijah simply stared at them. He wasn't sure if they genuinely respected him now, or if they were just trying to save face. He had no desire to rub his success in their faces, but he also wasn't willing to let them think they could just walk back into his life without any acknowledgement of the past. But What struck Elijah the most in this encounter was the realization that he had truly surpassed them, not in terms of money or fame, but in terms of resilience and growth. Elijah had faced countless obstacles and had always chosen to rise above them. While Greg and Oliver had been content to cling to their status and titles, Elijah had chosen a different path. He had turned his back on the idea of a life defined by appearances and had instead embraced the process of self-improvement and self-discovery. In that moment, Elijah understood something important. The success he had achieved wasn't about proving anyone wrong or seeking validation. It was about the journey itself, about proving to himself that he could break free from the constraints of his past and build a future that was truly his own. Elijah didn't dwell on the encounter with Greg and Oliver. It didn't matter anymore. What was important was how far he had come and the people who truly believed in him. And as he walked away from the meeting, he knew that he had the strength to continue moving forward, regardless of who came back into his life. As the years passed, Elijah's business became an enduring symbol of resilience. What started as a small, eco-friendly delivery service had expanded into a thriving enterprise, influencing industries far beyond the restaurant world. Elijah's commitment to sustainable practices, paired with his innovative approach to logistics, made him a leader in his field. Yet, despite his growing success, Elijah never lost sight of what had driven him in the first place, the desire to prove his worth to himself, not to others. Along the way, Elijah attracted a new circle of supporters and collaborators, people who shared his vision and who saw him for the values he embodied: integrity, hard work, and an unwavering commitment to making the world a better place. As his business flourished, Elijah found himself being invited to speak at conferences, sharing his story with others who were looking for inspiration. His story of overcoming ridicule and doubt became a beacon for those who faced their own challenges and obstacles in life. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Elijah's success was his ability to remain humble. While many of his peers in the business world became consumed with wealth and power, Elijah's focus remained on building something meaningful, a company that didn't just make money, but also made a positive impact on the world. He worked tirelessly to create a culture of kindness and respect within his business, always encouraging his employees to follow their passions and dreams. One of the most heartwarming moments came when Elijah received a letter from a former employee, someone who had worked with him during the early days of his business. The letter expressed gratitude for Elijah's leadership and for the way he had always treated his team with respect, regardless of their position or background. The letter ended with the words, "You changed my life, Elijah. You taught me that success isn't about what you have, but about who you become." Elijah's heart swelled with pride as he read those words. In many ways, this letter encapsulated everything he had hoped to achieve. Success had never been about the accolades or the recognition. It had always been about the legacy he left behind. His journey had come full circle, and he had become the man he had always hoped to be. Someone who inspired others, who lifted others up, and who proved that true greatness comes from within. As the years continued to unfold, Elijah's business grew to national recognition. He had long since moved past the petty mockery of his past. He had found his place in the world, not as someone who was defined by his job or his circumstances, but as someone who had transformed himself through his actions and values. His story was a testament to the power of resilience, self-reflection, and growth. And as he stood in his office one day, looking out over the city that had once seemed so distant and unattainable, Elijah knew that his journey was far from over. The future held new challenges and opportunities, and he was ready to face them with the same determination and courage that had guided him to this point.